My name is Rodolfo Domínguez Márquez. I'm a Mexican lawyer. I'm specialized on human rights laws and in gender violence against women. In Mexico, I coordinate a little NGO. We especially accompany cases of femicide in Mexico. We do strategic litigation. We also do advocacy for the implementation of mechanisms that will protect women who are in extreme violence situations, and I also do training for authorities so they can implement protocols for the investigation and prosecution of femicide, and I also develop models for the implementation of order protections for women in a gender violence situation.
You use the word femicide. How do you define femicide?
Femicide, at least at Mexico, we define it as the assassination of a woman for the fact of being a woman. We meant with this that femicide is a gender-based violence crime, a hate crime, in which women are killed because of discrimination, gender-based discrimination, in a society that considers a woman as a lower person.
Is this a social phenomenon in Mexico?
Yes, it's a social phenomenon that has spread all over the country in a context of generalized violence related with crime organization. But in this context, gender violence has a specific component because of the generalized discrimination against women we face in Mexico. So we have a situation that gets worse and worse each year because we don't have the necessary policies to prevent or to eliminate the impunity that surrounds these cases.
What are the laws, current laws in the country in terms of protection for women?
The current laws in Mexico regarding femicide have been changing for the last 10 years as the human rights movement of women's rights have make a huge advocacy for the recognition of femicide as a crime. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we didn't name this reality as femicide. So it was a violence really naturalized. It was always considered to be as a domestic kind of violence, so we would not sanction this kind of violence by laws. So the feminist movement especially has been working to recognize this reality by naming it. And we work to construct a legal concept of femicide. So right now at Mexico we have all the laws, or at least all the penal laws, the criminal laws consider this reality of femicide as a felony, as a crime. And we've worked in constructing a definition that will help us implement this definition so we can assure the justice in those cases. For example, we try to develop an objective definition of femicide. So in Mexico, femicide is the killing of a woman for gender reasons. And we have defined objectively these gender reasons. When we talk about gender reasons, we meant to explain the characteristics we've documented in many of the cases we were aware of. For example, one of these characteristics is the sexual violence related to the crime. Many women, before they are going to be killed, they are going to be sexually abused. Maybe they will be raped. So this is a characteristic of this gender-based violence. Sexual violence is one of the extreme forms of this gender-based violence. So we use the definition of sexual signs as gender reason related to femicide. The other reason has to be on the ways women are killed, the injuries we find in the bodies. So we find the brutality of the murders expressed in the bodies. Sometimes they are going to be choked to death. Sometimes they are going to be killed by the use of physical strength. Sometimes they use knives or this kind of arms, and they will they would slap the victims brutally. So we'll find a lot of injuries related to these kind of arms. These are many of the characteristics we understand as brutality, and they express this extreme violence against women in the bodies. Other elements we consider in the definition are the context of violence in which a lot of women live. So we call them the antecedents of violence in the cases, the continuum of violence. So we try to always understand the context in which this violence is made. So we have at least two kinds of context: the domestic context or the public context of violence. Especially in Mexico, we have a problem because of the influence of the criminal organizations. Many of the femicides are related with patterns of crime organization. For example, the main pattern we've detected is the disappearance of women who are going to be they're going to be sexually exploited, especially little girls between 11 and 17 years old. Many of them are going to will disappear before they are going to be found killed. And when we analyze the patterns, we'll know that they are going to be sexually exploited. Other patterns have to be with the relationship between the victim and the aggressor. Mainly, we have close relationships in which the victim and the aggressor have many, sometimes family relationships. For example, the husbands, the boyfriends, or close family that will kill women. So we also understand this as a pattern related to femicide. Other patterns have to be with exposure of the body in public spaces. For us, it's a message that it's sent to women so they won't be, or at least they won't feel safe in the public space. When you drop a body in the street, it's as if you consider the body as a waste. So you send a message as if the women and women's body are less than trash. So we consider this as an important element of femicide. Also, sometimes women who are found killed, they will disappear first. So we consider also the incommunication as an element of femicide. If the woman is not free before the femicide, we will consider this as an element of the gender-based violence and a gender reason for femicide. And sometimes when women cannot defend themselves because of the situation in which they are, we are also going to consider this as an element of the femicide. So we try to construct this objective definition, so we will have elements for the prosecution of the crime, and we'll have elements to achieve justice in those cases.
So what does honor killing mean in Mexico?
Honor killing in Mexico means a hate crime, a discrimination-related crime, that it's part of the violence against women constructed from a gender-based discrimination. So we don't talk about honor crimes no more. We name them as femicides. In Mexico, for a long years, in the past, for a lot of years, the authorities, the judicial authorities, considered honor crime as a justification for the assassination. So they would not consider these honor crimes or these honor homicides as a crime, and they would give little resolution. Well, the resolutions wouldn't be as high as in other kind of crimes. So they would not consider that as something that would deserve a crime or a sanction, a criminal sanction. So for the last years, this feminist movement has achieved to transform the conceptualization of these kind of crimes. They won't name them anymore as an honor crime, and they will consider it as a femicide, as an extreme form of violence against women.
Why is it important in a society, in a country, to reformulate something which used to be called in the past honor crimes to something which is now called femicide? Why is that process important?
It's very important to name things, to change the concepts. When we use the concept of honor crime, we were justifying a conduct. Especially it was when the husband would find his wife mainly with another man having sexual relations, especially. And they would justify the husband who would kill the woman. For us, it's important to name things as they are. This action is very dangerous because it's based on the conception of women as property of men. So we conceptualize this action as a discrimination situation. We're talking about gender-based violence, and we try to transform the concept we have about women. We are trying to transform this conception of women as objects that can be used by men and by males, and we try to sanction this situation by recognizing the gender-based violence. If you don't name the reality, you cannot transform this reality. So as human rights defenders, as we try to implement all human rights laws which consider equality and liberty as an important fundament of this core of international human rights laws, we need to understand that these situations are extreme violations of human rights laws. So we need to name this reality as what it really is, a gender-based violence that needs to be eradicated to guarantee all women's human rights.
Now, how do you explain that Mexico has such political violence? Violence as a means of interaction between the people. Why is Mexico considered as a violent society?
Mexico is considered a violent society against women because we are a very patriarchal society. Since ancient times, Mexican society has built as a very patriarchal society. The machismo, the macho man, is considered to be a normal way of being. So the macho is the man who will subjugate women, who will use women as objects, who will abuse sexually of women, and nothing would happen. So we are a society which has normalized completely this gender-based violence. So for a lot of time, we would not consider this kind of violence as something dangerous or something important to consider as a crime. So with the years, with the developing of the human rights laws by signing and committing to international human rights law, Mexico has now these obligations to eradicate violence against women. So an important way of doing this is by changing and naming the reality, this violent reality, to a reality which at least attend, investigate, and will try to eradicate this gender-based violence against women.
But have national studies or ongoing studies can help us define the number of victims or the potentialities? Can you share some of that with us?
Yeah. We have a problem in Mexico because authorities won't document all the cases of this kind of violence. But as human rights organizations, we've committed to document all these cases. So right now, for example, the Citizens National Observatory in Femicide, a huge network of at least 43 organizations of human rights organizations that work in 22 states of Mexico. We've done a lot of work to document the situation in Mexico. So I can tell you that at least for the last 3 years, we've documented almost 8,680 cases of femicides in Mexico. So it's a huge number if you consider the short time of time we've documented. And it's an example of the reality we are living right now in Mexico.
Do you have a women's affairs ministry in Mexico?
We have, at Mexico, we have a National Institute for Women that should be the federal institution which will work in developing policies with gender perspective, and its objective is to guarantee that all the government will have gender perspective as a transversal perspective which will be considered in the development of policies in Mexico. So for the last 14 years, we've been developing a huge legislation regarding human rights, women's human rights. So we have at least in legislation important instruments to guarantee women a life free of violence, to guarantee political rights for women, to guarantee the access and recognition of sexual and reproductive rights. So in black and white we have a good legislation. The problem is that it's not easily implemented because of the authorities which still have these discriminatory conceptions, that they are not really sensitive to the gender violence situation. So we've been working a lot to train them, to give them tools, and to implement different mechanisms so we will implement adequately the legislation to prevent, to attend, to sanction the violence against women in my country.
Because Mexico is a democratic country, which posts its laws as being more or less up to the level the international obligations force it. But as you say, the challenge is how do you implement this? You have good laws, how is it implemented? Is it because some bad people don't want to implement it? Or is there a whole mechanism which stops this implementation? So you spoke of training. I don't know if you want to speak about how education is used. If you have groups of people working on the syllabus of the schools to see to what extent what we learn as children at school condones this or questions this, like the gender roles, etc. What is the role of culture? I want to know if there is a concerted effort between you members of civil society in changing that mentality.
Changing mentalities is the huge objective. We need to transform the way people understand the roles women and men play in this society. The cultural transformation is the main objective, but it's not easy at all. We've been trying to develop strategies, but it's not easy. As we are a really conservative society, we have religion, we have a lot of institutions that helps the patriarchal conception to keep developing. It's really difficult to transform all these institutions. I think it takes a lot of time, and it's the huge big objective in which we all should be working, from education, from culture, from transforming a lot of consolidated institutions in our society so we can make people more sensitive about the discrimination against women, the violence against women situation we are facing right now. Sadly, I cannot say we're being successful on that. We are trying to use media, to use other tools and mechanisms to try to get into young people so they would have another idea about what gender is, on understanding how we construct this gender-based violence so we can transform that reality. The situation is still a huge thing to do in the future. We need to work with a lot of institutions, with schools, with universities. We need to work, I think, especially with little kids. So since they are little, they can start building a non-patriarchal society. We need to give them tools to have a gender perspective which will allow them to understand diversity between people. For me, to understand diversity is really important because it will allow us to understand the difference between persons, not speaking only about women and male. We are not anymore two poles. We are a huge rainbow of diversity possibilities, diverse possibilities that will help us construct a more equal society.
Like, for example, when we're talking about organized crime, would you say that specific ethnic groups or indigenous people are more targeted by the organized crime? When the girls or women are abducted for prostitution and sexual slavery?
The ethnic perspective is important in Mexico because we have a huge number of population that is indigenous people. And we have a lot of culture and traditional costumes that are, or a lot of indigenous traditions that are very violent against women. So we have a huge issue regarding all these traditions because it's difficult to transform them, because in Mexico traditions are protected by the Constitution. So we are trying to advocate to transform from the root grounds all these negative or these discriminatory or these violent traditions, so they will be respectful of human rights.
Can you give an example?
Yes, for example, in many communities it's common to sell women. So little girls from around 13 years old, 12, 13, 14 years old will be sold to other people so they will get married. So that's a huge problem because it normalizes sexual violence against women.
So it's marriage, or it's for example, housework or work on land?
No, it's mostly for marriage. We don't have, at least from the traditional, at least tradition will be more favorable to allow these sales for marriage.
Which I imagine is banned by law.
No, it's not. We are working to ban underage marriages. So
what is the law in the age of marriage?
We've been transforming. Our federal law has a recent reform, so it will prohibit marriage between underage kids, children. But many of our local laws, a civil law regarding marriage is a local jurisdiction. Many of our local legislation still allows marriage between younger age people. Especially, it's prohibited before 14 years old before 14-year-old girls and 16-year-old boys. So we are trying to transform that legislation so we will not permit marriage between underage kids. But it's still, we need to do a lot of work to transform all our legislation. But having our federal law reform, it's a big step. It will help us make the homologation of laws, so we will in the future prohibit underage marriage.
Your example is a good one because it's very interesting to see that this problem has a geography much wider than you think, and it's not only related to one specific religion and not to the other. These are traditions which precede these religions also in that sense. Now my question is, you have been referring to the question of organized crime, and we need you to explain and expand a little bit, especially when it comes to this issue of human trafficking and prostitution, and why it's a lucrative business, and does it only limit itself to Mexico or go beyond?
Crime organizations' problem in Mexico is a huge problem. Since 2012, we have a security policy that mainly is a war against crime organizations. But this war has been really unsuccessful on dealing with this problem. Instead of eradicating the problem, right now we have a huge problem regarding crime organizations. They are really strong in Mexico, and they have a big influence in a lot of territories in Mexico, but also in the government. Corruption is a big problem right now regarding crime organizations because they have infiltrated almost all the government. So right now, the situation with crime organization is a big issue. Before 2012, the main market related to crime organization was drug dealing. But right now, the drugs are not the main market, it's not the main business for crime organizations. Right now, the most important market and business for crime organization is human trafficking, especially for sexual exploitation. So right now, we have a huge problem regarding human trafficking, especially with little boys and girls, because now they are being abducted, so they will be exploited not only in Mexico but in other countries. We have a state in the central part of Mexico named Tlaxcala, and it's famous because it's a place where prostitution is completely normalized. So now we have prostitution cartels that work not only in Mexico but in other countries. So now we know there's a huge route of human trafficking that goes from Mexico to the United States, to some places in Asia and Europe. So right now, there is a huge problem regarding human trafficking. We've documented cases of babies, little boys and girls between, since they are recently born to 7, 8, 9 years old that are going to be sexually exploited. And we have a huge problem in this gap between 17 and 17-year-old girls that are going to be sexually exploited by human trafficking in Mexico and other countries.
So you once told me that as a lawyer and as a activist against femicide, sometimes you feel that your role is to just count the bodies.
As human rights defenders and as an organization that is committed to eradicating femicide, the first thing we had to do was document the cases. So we start counting with the deaths. And counting deaths is a problem because sometimes they are only considered as numbers. When you consider a death as a number, you forget about the cruel story behind that crime. When we document the cases, we learn the stories about these girls, these women that are being murdered. And we understand that each number is a life. So when you understand that 8 women are killed each day, you understand that each day 8 persons have their lives annihilated. A whole future is annihilated, and that makes a huge difference because you start understanding the suffering, the huge violence regarding all these crimes. When you understand that half of these crimes have to be or are related to kids, girls that have been sexually exploited, the dimension of the problematic becomes terrible. You need to understand that a girl, a little boy, or a woman who is going to be sexually exploited can be forced to have 70 or 80 sexual relationships each day. Each sexual relation will be forced. Sometimes they will be drugged, so they will handle the situation. The expectancy of life of a girl or a woman who is going to be sexually exploited is 1 or 2 years. So When you dimension this, the situation becomes terrible. When you document as us the cases of babies found dead, and when they do the autopsies, they find in the little stomachs semen, you know. You understand the lack of humanity in these cases. So the situation is terrible. And it's been very difficult to eradicate this situation because we fight not only with crime organizations that are very strong, that have arms, power, and they control a lot of territories, but we also face with the corruption of authorities. And that puts us in huge risk as human rights defenders.
In many countries of the world, we are now facing the issue of corruption and organized crimes, or mafias, or interest groups, which are non-state actors, or violent actors. And our governments talk about it, saying, well, what do you want? This is organized crime outside my sphere. But what is the responsibility of the state?
I think when we talk about this gender-based violence, we need to talk about extremism, an extremism. And as an extremism, we should have authorities and a state committed to eradicate these extremisms. But in Mexico, our authorities, sadly, they won't work to eradicate this situation.
Because they have interest in it.
Yes, they have interest in this huge business of human trafficking. And as corruption is a huge problem in the country, this corruption generates a huge situation of impunity. At least in Mexico, cases regarding gender-based violence and extreme gender-based violence as disappearance, sexual exploitation, and femicide, we have 99% of impunity. Impunity is based on two situations: the lack of good investigations and the lack of the prosecution, the real prosecution of crimes. And we also have a problem with the judicial power, with judges that won't act with due diligence in these cases, that we will have resolutions that will try to invisibilize this kind of violence. So when you don't have good investigations and you don't have good resolutions, you have impunity. And impunity sends a message of tolerance, of a message that will tell women that they can be murdered, they can be violented, and nothing will happen. And this puts women in a huge risk. If we don't combat this impunity, we won't never eradicate the problem. And as it has been happening in Mexico, the problem will get worse and worse each time.
I'm going to conclude slowly, but before that, I would like to speak about what is the role of, for example, women's rights movements, or civil society movements, or waves which are internationally led. For example, the Me Too movement. Mm-hmm. Does it have any impact, or do you have similar yes. things which mobilize public opinion?
In Mexico, the human rights movement, especially the feminist movement, has been fundamental for transforming a reality. The work, human rights organizations, especially those led by women, are of huge importance because they've been doing most of the work the state has not done. For example, we've been developing these really interesting mechanisms to prevent violence or to attend violence. For example, the Gender Violence Alert, which is a real new mechanism in Mexico, contemplated in our legislation for eliminating violence against women and to guarantee a life free of violence, in which human rights organizations can ask the government and can make good, they will make the they can force the government to attend situations of extreme violence in certain places and time in the country. So this mechanism will allow us to make evident a situation of violence and will help us transform or correct the policies that are not working to prevent, to attend or to sanction violence against women. We can work in security policies, in judicial policies, or in prevention policies to eradicate this violence against women. So it's because of the human rights movement that we were able to visualize this problem for the last years. When it was all in the dark, it was because of the movement we could get this into the eyes of the authorities, and right now because of this movement, the problem of violence against women, it's one of the most important topics in the public agenda. So right now, this will help us have more elements to have a real advocacy with authorities to establish new mechanisms to prevent this violence.
You're a lawyer. Can you help me define what a state of war means?
Okay.
How do we define war?
War, for me, for me at least as a lawyer, war is a situation of generalized violence in a territory. War can have many shapes. It doesn't need to be a war between two states. It can be a war between powerful groups. For example, in Mexico, I think we have a war of crime organizations against the people. And we have a state and a government that it's also against people because its policies regarding security, it's more related to a war than it's more favorable to build a war situation than in building a peace situation. We don't work, or at least our authorities are not working to build peace. They are working to have a conflict in Mexico that it's not named, or it's not we're not understanding it as a war situation. So for me, war is a situation of conflict that has a humanitarian crisis, which have an impact in civil society because it breaks the social network and it generates a situation of insecurity, of impunity, and a bloodshed that is devastating our communities and our country.
Gender-based violence. It's a pacifying formulation for a reality. I'm not sure it necessarily totally captures what's happening. Would it be too wrong to say that there was a war against women?
It depends from which perspective you understand this reality. If you ask me, I will name it as a war against women, a war of males, of men against women, and that it's based in an ancient construction of a patriarchal society which has considered women as second-class persons. So it's been an ancient war which have turned women into objects, into sexual objects, into property of men. And right now, this war can be understood, or can be, you can understand this war in these extreme expressions of violence against women. We name it femicide, others name it honor crimes, but when you understand the situation of women worldwide, you will understand that this is a common situation for all women. In any places you see conflict, you see war, you will see that women had the worst part because of this gender-based violence. You can be in Syria and you will have a war, but you go to the refugees camps, and you will see that many of those women will be sexually exploited, there will be rapes, there will be sexual violence against them, and it's really common. In other places, marriage will be forced to little girls, they will be raped because they don't have the opportunity to consent those marriages. So if we understand the situation of women worldwide, you will understand it's a war against them. It's a war which tends to destroy them, to destroy the bodies, to destroy those beings. And it's a huge problem in our culture. I think violence is worldwide spread. This gender-based violence is completely normalized in a lot of our cultures. Religion, politics, society tends to normalize this kind of violence. In many cases, they will promote this kind of violence. So we need to transform the mentality of people. We need to transform our societies in the understanding of the discrimination and the violence based on gender, so we can construct a better society free of this kind of violence.
Thank you. Would you like to add anything else?
No.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.